All right, let's dive into what might be the single greatest story ever told, the story of life itself. And the amazing part is, it's a story that every single one of us is a part of. Now, when you think of evolution, you might picture that classic, kind of misleading image of an ape slowly standing up to become a human. But that's not it at all. The real story is so much bigger. Imagine a vast, sprawling, branching tree that connects every living thing you've ever seen, from the tiniest bacteria to the biggest blue whale. So, how did this incredible, messy, beautiful story actually happen? Let's find out. So here's our game plan. First, we're going to rewind all the way back to the very beginning, to the cosmic ingredients that made life possible. Then we'll get into the brilliant idea that finally explained how life got so diverse. After that, we'll play detective and look at the clues life left behind. We'll take a quick journey through billions of years of history, and finally, we'll zoom in on our own little branch of the tree and see where we fit into this epic tale. To really get the story of life, you have to zoom out. I mean, way, way out. See, our story doesn't start in some primordial pond or ancient forest. Nope. It starts with the Big Bang, with the birth of the universe itself, billions and billions of years ago. The scale of this is it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. So let's try to break it down. Okay, just look at these numbers. For billions of years after the universe began, there was, well, not much, just gas and dust. Then, about 4.5 billion years ago, our home, planet Earth, finally takes shape. But here's the really wild part. Life gets started fast. I mean, geologically speaking, it's almost right away. Only 500 million years after the planet cooled down, we see the very first whispers of life. And by 3 billion years ago, you have these crucial molecules, RNA and proteins, that are basically the essential starter kit for a living cell. So that's the big question, right? How do you go from a barren rock flying through space to a planet teeming with life? Well, the leading theory is something called chemical evolution. Think of it like this. Before you can have biology, you need chemistry. The planet had all these simple, inorganic raw materials, and somehow they had to cook themselves into the more complex, organic molecules, the actual building blocks of life. And this isn't just a guess. This is where science got really clever. The famous Miller-Urey experiment basically created a miniature early Earth in a bottle. They put in the gases they thought were in the atmosphere, zapped it with electricity to simulate lightning, and cranked up the heat. And what happened was absolutely mind-blowing. Out of that simple, non-living soup, they created amino acids, the very things that make up proteins, the stuff we're made of. It was a huge discovery because it showed that the leap from non-life to the ingredients for life wasn't some kind of impossible miracle. It was just chemistry. Okay, so we've got the ingredients, the building blocks. But how do you get from a simple chemical soup to the staggering, breathtaking diversity of life we see today, from fungus to flamingos? Well, that massive puzzle was solved by the star of our show, Charles Darwin. He came up with the recipe, the mechanism that could explain it all. Now, before Darwin, other people were thinking about this stuff. A guy named Lamarck had an idea that, say, a giraffe stretched its neck its whole life to reach higher leaves, and because it stretched so much, its babies were born with slightly longer necks. It sounds logical, but it's not quite how it works. Darwin's idea was way more powerful. He said, look, the variation is already there. In any group of giraffes, some are just randomly born with slightly longer necks than others. And in a place with tall trees, who's going to eat better? The long-necked ones. And if they eat better, they're more likely to survive and have more babies, who will probably inherit those longer necks. And when you really boil it down, natural selection is it's beautifully simple. It just requires a few things. First, you need variation. Everybody's a little different. Second, those differences have to be heritable. You pass them on to your kids. Third, there's competition. There's not enough food and resources for everyone. Put those things together, and you get what Darwin called reproductive fitness. And this is the key. It's not always about being the strongest or the fastest. It is simply about who leaves the most offspring that survive. That's it. That's the engine of evolution. Now, that is one heck of a theory, but any great theory needs great evidence to back it up. And the amazing thing about evolution is that the evidence is everywhere. I mean, it's written in the fossil record, it's in the bodies of living animals, it's even in our own DNA. The clues are all around us. So let's go look at a few. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence is something called homologous structures. The best way to think about it is like a car company that uses the same basic frame. the same chassis, to build a whole bunch of different models. They'll build a pickup truck, a minivan, and a sports car all on that same underlying platform. The cars look different, they do totally different things, but underneath it all, that shared blueprint tells you they came from the same factory. And this is a perfect example from the animal kingdom. Just look at the arm of a human, the leg of a cheetah, the flipper of a whale, and the wing of a bat. One is for grabbing things, one for sprinting, one for swimming, and one for flying. Completely different jobs. And yet, they are all built from the exact same set of bones. One upper arm bone, two forearm bones, a bunch of little wrist bones, and then the finger bones. That shared blueprint is just screaming that all of these mammals inherited this basic design from a shared ancestor long, long ago. Okay, now for a story that shows us evolution happening in real time, right before our very eyes. So picture England back in the 1850s, before the Industrial Revolution really kicked into high gear. The tree trunks were mostly light-colored, covered in lichen. And most of the peppered moths were this whitish, speckled color, which was perfect camouflage. They blended right in. Now, there were a few dark-colored moths, but they were super rare because against a light background, they stuck out like a sore thumb, and birds would just gobble them up. But then, the factories came. They started pumping out tons of black soot that coated everything, including the tree trunks, turning them dark. And all of a sudden, the whole game changed. The tables were completely turned. Now, the light-colored moths were the ones that stood out, and birds picked them off easily. But the dark moths, they were perfectly camouflaged. They survived, they had more babies, and within a few decades, almost the entire moth population in those industrial areas was dark. It's just a perfect, beautiful illustration of natural selection in action. The environment changed, and the population adapted. So now that we have the how, natural selection, and the evidence that it happens, we can zoom back out and look at the what. We can look at the grand, sweeping story of life on this planet. So buckle up, because we're about to cover about 2 billion years of history in just a few seconds. So for billions of years, life was pretty simple stuff, mostly single cells floating around. But then, about 500 million years ago, bam! A massive explosion of complexity. You get all these incredible invertebrates. Then life makes its next giant leap. It crawls out of the water and invades the land. First the plants, then the amphibians. This, of course, sets the stage for the age of reptiles, and the dinosaurs begin their incredible 150 million year reign. But their story comes to a dramatic end, and that catastrophic ending created a huge opportunity, a new beginning for the mammals, and eventually a new beginning for us. And that brings us right up to the final chapter of our story today. And it's a chapter that's pretty personal for all of us. It's the story of how our own species, Homo sapiens, finally took its place on this incredible ancient stage. Our own twig on the great tree of life is a pretty recent addition, but it's been a busy one. It all starts with our primate ancestors, but the real game changer was when creatures like the Australopithecines started walking on two legs. That freed up the hands, which paved the way for tool use and for our own genus, Homo. And you can see the trend here, right? Brains just keep getting bigger. We even shared the planet for a while with our very clever cousins, the Neanderthals. Then, finally, modern Homo sapiens arrives on the scene. We managed to survive an ice age. And then, with the invention of agriculture only about 10,000 years ago, we started to fundamentally change the planet itself. And that pretty much brings us to the day. The one thing to really take away from all of this is that evolution doesn't have a goal. It's not trying to get anywhere. The technical term is stochastic, which basically just means it's driven by chance. Chance mutations, chance environmental changes. It's not a ladder climbing inevitably towards us as the pinnacle. We're just one tiny recent branch on an immense, chaotic, and beautiful tree of life, which leaves us with a pretty deep question. If chance is what got us here, what does chance have in store for our future?